Chapter 33. Uncle Paul was asleep. His pale face rested on a pile of pillows, and the papery, translucent texture of his skin was even more marked. Paul snored gently while he slept, and Martin James wondered how long his uncle could last. This realization, coupled with the blankness he'd been experiencing ever since he'd known Samantha was being held by the police, and particularly by Gwendryth James, weighed heavily on him. It was a mood that he did his best to shake off. There was autumnal sunshine outside, after all. This continued clear, cold weather, unusual for Wales, couldn't last. He decided to leave his uncle sleeping for a while, and he made his way downstairs to discuss the situation with Michael Portman. When he arrived on the ground floor, he found the owner of the rectory sitting in one of the leather armchairs in the annex with someone he recognized. A large man with a reddish cast to his face and hair that was slightly too long. Wyndham Spencer James. It was too late to retreat back to his uncle's bedroom, and in any case, Martin was disinclined to do anything so obvious. He would have preferred neutrality or even a complete ignoring of the situation, but he was not to be so lucky. "I believe you two know each other," Michael Portman said, beckoning Martin over towards them. "We're cousins," Wyndham Spencer James said. Although it was still quite early in the afternoon, a cut-glass tumbler of whiskey sat on the small table in front of him. Michael Portman had coffee, Martin noticed. "Second cousins," Martin replied. There was something about Wyndham Spencer James that irritated him. A holdover from their previous meeting, perhaps, or something more endemic. "I want his house," Wyndham Spencer James said, in a voice that betrayed no emotion. "I've come to talk about my uncle," Martin said to Michael Portman. "A fine old man," Wyndham Spencer James announced to no one in particular. "And a very ill one." Martin continued to speak to Michael Portman, who remained seated in his chair. He gestured to Martin to sit down, and as he did so, he said that he agreed with him that his Uncle Paul was becoming weaker, but that he, Portman, was prepared for him to stay at the rectory for as long as that was possible. "I think it would kill him to move now," Martin said. Both he and Michael Portman knew that they were facing the inevitable, that there was nothing they could do about Paul's decline except make it as comfortable as possible. In this, it seemed that they were joined by a mutual respect for someone who, despite any other more obvious faults, was always honest about his own opinions. If they were not ones with which Martin could easily sympathize, that had not prohibited, in recent weeks, a sense of drawing closer to his uncle and of sharing a mutual, if difficult, family history. Michael Portman offered him a whiskey, but Martin declined and said that he would prefer coffee if there were any available. Michael Portman nodded and got up, leaving Martin alone with his second cousin. Wyndham Spencer James was leaning back in his armchair looking out to sea. His legs were stretched out in front of him, revealing well-tailored trousers and punched brogues that looked handmade. "The two places were connected, you know," Wyndham Spencer James said after a little while. "I don't follow." "This place and Plas Las. Very early on, they were inhabited by the same family, the Pritchards or Ap Richards. One brother controlled the manor, the other was the vicar here. Like Jane Austen in Wales." Wyndham Spencer James turned in Martin's direction. "That's a phrase I recognize. You've been talking to Ffion Roberts." What if I have? Be careful, Martin. Ffion Roberts might be attractive, but she always has a political axe to grind. So? She wants us to understand history so we can understand ourselves. And what's wrong with that? I am much less interested in understanding than I am in possession, Wyndham Spencer James said, as Michael Portman returned with some coffee. Possession is 9/10 of history. I thought it was of the law. That's because you're more sentimental than I am, Wyndham Spencer James said. He gestured towards the open sea, beyond the conservatory. Why has it taken us so long to realize our natural resources? Our lack of expectation for wind, for example, is not because of our ignorance. It's because of the fact there was no percentage to be gained from it. And now there is. Exactly. And you want my house to pursue it. Wyndham Spencer James changed position. He looked directly at Martin when he said, I don't think of it as your house. I think of it as a James house. And if I want it, it is to redeem my side of the family. Michael Portman must have sensed the rising tension. He turned to Martin and he said, You mustn't mind Spencer. Good thing about him, he's always frank about his needs. In this case, it cuts across my own, Martin said, suddenly decided that he'd had enough, and he would go back upstairs to see if Paul had woken up. He drank his coffee quickly. That's competition, Michael Portman said in reply to Martin's last remark. I didn't even know he was called Spencer, Martin said, gesturing towards his cousin. That's because blood only goes so deep, Wyndham Spencer James said. He poured himself some more whiskey. Deep enough for murder, Martin said. He was angry. It disturbed him that neither of the two other men had mentioned the fact that Samantha Merriam had been arrested for the murder of her father, or that Queenie Rogers was now lying in the morgue at Miser-Bont. They seemed inured to both deaths, and that upset him. Paul was awake when Martin returned to his room. He was awake and listening to some music that came from the radio that sat on the bedside table. It was a string quartet that Martin recognized. Haydn's The Emperor. As the complex interweaving and sometimes contradictory strains of the violin echoed across the small room, Martin marveled at his uncle's tenacity. Earlier, it had seemed he couldn't possibly last long. Now, while he was not strong, he was full of an unusual, even feverish energy. Martin. He called his name as soon as he came into the room, and he seemed glad to see him. Martin explained that he'd visited earlier, but that Paul had been asleep, so he'd gone downstairs and talked with Michael Portman and Wyndham Spencer James. Him, Paul said. How was he? The usual. I used to try not to blame him, I tried all the usual approaches. I tried to blame his family, especially his father. Martin came nearer to Paul's bedside. Is there something you haven't told me? I don't think so, Paul said. About your cousin, Wyndham Spencer James's father, Martin persisted. What was his name? Caradog? No, that was his father. They were both vicars. My cousin was called Anthony. He'd be about my age if he was still alive. A bit older, perhaps. But he's long gone. Martin sat down on the only available chair. Paul looked slightly better from the shadow side of the room. Are you sure there's something you're not telling me? I don't think so. It's well enough known at the time. The gap between the generations was huge, sometimes, Martin thought. Even now, there was something that Paul didn't want to bring into the light, on the grounds that sometime, years ago perhaps, everyone had known about it. What was known, he said. He did his best to keep any impatience out of his voice. There was another pause. The intertwining strains of the music complemented and questioned each other. Anthony's problem. So there is something, isn't there? Uncle Paul pulled himself up, and Martin rearranged the pillows for him. His uncle's eyes were bright with a strange, almost luminous quality. They were all vicars, like I said. Anthony's father, his father. They were vicars going back well into the early 19th century. All of the same church, St. Michael's. It was almost as if it was an inherited living. Wyndham Spencer James was the first to break out of it. You can't blame him in a way, especially after his father. What was wrong with his father? Martin said. He knew it was no good hurrying Paul at this stage. There was another pause. I don't like to tell you. Even after all this time? A movement of the quartet finished, and a different one began. Now it was the well-known part of the Emperor, which Martin had always found rather pompous. Well, he's probably a manic depressive, Paul said reluctantly. You mean bipolar? I don't think it was ever officially diagnosed, Paul said. But he would sometimes go missing for days at a time. Once, I remember, they found him in the belfry, trying to take his cassock off. Sounds quite humorous to me, Martin said. You couldn't help it. Not in this community, and especially not then, Paul insisted. Church of England in Wales has always been an odd but respected institution. Anthony Spencer James's behaviour threatened the reputation of the family in this district. And that was important. There was more than a hint of stuffiness in Paul's last remark, and Martin didn't like it. Paul refused to answer the question directly, but his attitude was more than clear. Your uncle Josiah made money and bought Plus One Lass. My father went to London and also did well. The Spencer Jameses stayed and were poor. They were vicars, Martin. But Anthony was a questioning man, even if some people did find him too ascetic. He lived on virtually nothing and wrote articles about the nature of humanity in the parish magazine. He thought his talent should have been more recognized. He was right. But he was unstable. Martin wanted to get to the bottom of it, if he could. He was unreliable, yes. He eventually had to be put away because of his behaviour. When was that exactly? Uncle Paul thought for a moment. Let me see. Sometime after Harriet's death, I think. Around 1953. Where was he locked up? Don't put it like that, Martin, Paul said. We're talking about family. Where? It was an institution. Somewhere local, Paul conceded. I don't know exactly. I never went to see him. Relations between the two sides of the family were never that good. Why not? If I was going to be truthful, Paul said, I would have to say that it was partly because they were jealous of us having +1 laws. All right, yes. Anthony was always bothering Henrietta for this or for that, usually money, trying to exploit the connection. You can't blame him in a way, I suppose. There was a direct question to ask, and Martin saw no need not to ask it now. Do you think that Anthony was locked up because he was connected to Henrietta's death in some way? It was obvious that Paul thought he had now gone too far. He was a relative. I never said that, Martin. The music came to an end suddenly. You didn't need to. All at once, Martin had had enough. He wanted to get out of the confined room with its layers of secrets, away from his Uncle Paul, who, despite his increasing fragility, was still capable of clinging to the layers of propriety in ways that now seemed to Martin to be endemic to that whole generation. After a while, he made his excuses and left. It was an ordinary enough looking church on a hill surrounded by a churchyard. Ordinary enough for Wales, which meant that it wasn't ordinary at all. It had a squat tower at one end, whose origins looked defensive rather than religious, and this was joined awkwardly to the main body of the building, where the stonework had probably been restored by some overzealous Victorian. The now pointed windows had obviously once been of a different shape. Their Gothic traceries were oddly incongruous with the rest of the building, which was bathed in fading afternoon light. Martin James stood in front of the restored porch as ominous storm clouds gathered over the nearby mountains. A wind began to blow as Martin's companion, Ffion Roberts, pulled the collar of her coat closer and said, "So you wanted to see St. Michael's?" They went through the porch and into the church together, Martin feeling slightly apprehensive of trespassing on the territory of the Spencer Jameses, but also driven by a strange sense of connection. The details of the place were ordinary enough. A notice about communion services fluttered limply on a damp notice board. Inside, he noticed immediately that familiar religious smell, which seemed to be composed of an odd combination of beeswax polish and must. The interior of the church was darker than he'd expected. Shafts of a gloomy light came through the arched windows into the grey stone interior, which was plastered only in places. The floor was of worn flags, the pews of a close-grained fir that would now be unobtainable. The total, inescapable impression was of a place far older than its incidental details. A place that reached back to a more primitive and perhaps more transcendent form of religion. Incongruously, at the far end of the church, a bent figure in a brown dress was fiddling with the candlesticks on the altar. A portable wet and dry vacuum cleaner with its lead uncoiled lay near her. Couldn't have been much of a living, could it? Martin said, aware, even as he said it, of a certain material crassness in his thought. But he couldn't help contrasting the apparent meagreness of his cousin's inheritance with his own. Now he understood what it was that Wyndham Spencer James was fleeing from. For the first time, he felt that his own side of the family really had been more fortunate. This was a church of much atmosphere, but scant comfort. Its emanations were not for the faint-hearted. Originally, Jameses would have held 2 or 3 livings together. Their numbers shrank over time. By livings, you mean churches? I mean parishes, Ffion Roberts said. She came closer to him and she smiled. You really don't know much about the ecclesiastical history of your own country, do you? Martin confessed that he didn't. What he didn't say was that before his return to Wales, he couldn't have cared less. Now, he had to admit he felt differently about it. This striking place called to him in spite of his discomfort. Its unsettling coldness already seemed oddly familiar. It was the family church for generations, Ffion said, as if echoing his thoughts. Both your great-uncle and your uncle preached and practiced here, including the one that was crazy. That's too strong a word, Martin. Anthony Spencer James was a well-known local eccentric. He learned a very bookish Welsh, and he would address local farmers with quotations from medieval Welsh poetry. On harvest festivals, he plaited corn dollies, and he refused to use imported straw. They locked him up, didn't they? In the 1950s, Ffion said, as they walked down the aisle together. I checked, as you requested. He was confined in a local hospital the other side of town. It was closed down about 20 years ago. Do you think he could have murdered my aunt? It was a question that had been bothering him since yesterday, ever since his Uncle Paul had revealed another layer of secrets. Now it was out in the open. It seemed too obvious a question. I suppose it is possible, Ffion admitted. They stopped before a wall plaque commemorating the war dead. The floor beneath them was slightly sunken with a slab whose inscription was now indecipherable. But no one mentioned it at the time. Suppose, Martin said, that William Davis, the deaf-mute, was arrested to draw attention away from a more obvious culprit. One with better connections. I never thought of you as a conspiracy theorist, Ffion said. She stopped at the end of the church and seemed to be contemplating the altar where a crisp white cloth set off the surrounding stonework. I didn't either, Martin said. The woman in the brown dress, who was doing the cleaning, looked up and asked them to leave in a surprisingly cultivated voice. The church wasn't usually open, she explained. Services were held once every 2 weeks. Attendance was small. There was a lot of maintenance to be done. Any donations would be more than welcome. On their way out, Martin placed a few pounds in the donation box at the back of the church. He didn't really want to leave. After everything that had happened, it was as if he was comforted by the austerity of the place. When Martin walked outside the church, Ffion was standing next to a group of gravestones to the left of the gate that was set in the churchyard wall. There the ground sloped upwards and big slabs of a dark purple slate were set firmly in the earth, as if they were meant to occupy the space forever. Ffion beckoned him over, and he joined her on the rising ground. Down below, the land fell away in a series of steps, until, at the bottom of the valley, a series of whitewashed farms tucked themselves into the fold of the hill and faced a meandering river. She was standing next to a tall purplish headstone when he joined her. It was a thick slab of cut stone, but time had been working hard at it over 100 years, and the lettering was worn in places. It was in Welsh. To the memory of Samuel James, solicitor, Ffion translated, formerly of this parish, died Hampstead, London, April 1880. It's my great-grandfather, Martin said. And the realization that he was standing in the burial ground of most of the James family came slowly home. His grandfather was missing for some reason, but next to his father were the graves of Martin's aunts, Henrietta and Sylvia. Then there was Treddeg and Anthony Spencer James, the vicars who were Wyndham Spencer James's close relatives. Finally, in a stained white granite with chips that needed weeding, was a memorial to his own parents. You didn't know? Ffion said gently. She must have sensed he was surprised. I never asked, Martin said. Paul could have told me, I suppose, but I never asked. He felt an uncertain numbness creep over him. It seemed to come from his left arm, but he knew that wasn't really possible. It was cold. He knew that he should move. There was a long streaked cloud surrounded by layers of a dark gold light. There was the smell of damp, and then there was a sleepy sort of smell as he went back into something else, and his father carried him into the dark house and up the stairs. You stay here, Martin, his father had said, and he tucked the bedclothes around him in the blue attic bedroom of Plas Las. We won't be long. That was the last time he had ever seen him. Now the light outside the church was darkening in his numbness. There was a feeling of damp. He was cold, but he couldn't move, so he stood there with the dead, all the ones who had inhabited Plas Las and its surroundings before them, his great-grandfather, his uncles, his aunts. Then all of a sudden, he felt an overwhelming desire to sleep with someone, anyone who would take away the awful, nauseating, numb feeling. He was grateful when he realized that Ffion Roberts had touched him on the arm. He took me back to the house, he said, still looking at his parents' grave. My father put me to bed. They went out into the night and they never came back. I'm sorry, Ffion Roberts said. She was still touching him, but there was a lightness about it that he found reassuring. Then Martin James looked up from the memorial to his parents and beyond to the graves where his other relatives were lined up in rows, as if awaiting some final accounting. Churchyard was a stark place, he thought, but at the same time it held a kind of solitary magic, a majestic bleakness of stone. Then it happened. There was a sharp crack, and something hit the nearest tombstone and ricocheted off it. Ffion Roberts called out and fell to the ground, clutching her arm. From the other side of the churchyard, Martin thought he saw some movement, but he couldn't be sure. He bent over Ffion. She was breathing, but in obvious pain. He took out his mobile phone, but there was no signal, so he picked her up gently and carried her over to the Land Rover and started it up. Then, for the second time in 2 weeks, he drove as fast as he dared to Miser Bont General Hospital.